What we're going to do now is we're going to bring all the speakers up to the front for a panel discussion to allow you to ask all the questions that you weren't able to because we ran out of time. And what we'll do is you guys can have a stand up. Don't head out and, I don't know, go and do something, but just stand up and shake your feet, and then I'll grab the speakers to the front. Before I do, I'd like to give all the speakers a clap. What I really enjoyed was a lot of consistency coming out of the people who did speak. Good. Let's do it.
Opinionated and wise aren't the same thing.
Can you bring Andrew up on?
Sorry?
Can you bring Andrew up on?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a no for getting Andrew in.
Well, perhaps we'll make a start, and then if Andrew Tait happens to get his camera on, and we're still going to have problems with muting and unmuting, aren't we, guys?
No,
They can get it sorted. They're pretty clever. Okay. Look, so I'm going to start off with just a question or two, and then I'm really hoping that for this to be useful, that you will have some questions for the team, and just do what you were doing before. So sing out, put your hand up, and we'll bring the microphone to you. We're going to have to juggle it backwards and forwards a little bit to the team because we've got one microphone, and we want the people online to be able to hear it as well. So I just want to pick up on, I jotted down when Dan was talking a question that was already kind of partly sitting in my head, which was it's that question of capacity. And so we're asking people to do, in Bruce's words, some quite repetitive, some detailed focused sorts of things. Maybe less so when they're not having to go and measure pasture precisely, but there's still a whole load of other things they have to measure. And then we're asking them to now take on a whole load of thinking about soils and biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, water. How are farmers, how are they going to take this on, and what do you expect to see in terms of the impacts as they kind of try and roll all of this into their farming? Anyone want to jump in? Why don't we start there and pass it to you?
So I think this is quite a concern. I think farmers have got only a certain amount of concentration, and it seems to me, I'm getting on a bit now, so I remember back to the good old days when we talk about residuals and where are they going next, and let's look at your clover content, and then most of the field days I go to are all around farm plans and how are you going to comply with them and things like that. There's a huge amount of energy going into that, and I don't think farmers just multiply up their energy levels to cope with everything. But they only actually make money out of growing grass cheaply, harvesting it well into products that are worth something. There is nothing else that they make money out of, usually. So that's the bit that they've got to get right. Otherwise, all those other things get worse. The worst farms, environmentally, compliance-wise, are farms that have lost their concentration, aren't making any money. No matter how much you do your farm planning, it's still going to be a problem.
Yeah, I think I can vociferously agree with that. If you're not getting the grass part right, you're not getting the profit part right, are you going to be around to get any of those other things sorted?
I agree. I agree. I also think that too that there's a bit of a grief cycle, right? So at the moment, in particular, there's a real it really is a struggle for people to think about, and for farmers to sort of get beyond the pain part of the grief cycle, or the ignoring part, because of the government, all of the things the government's doing to it. But that's why when I talk about that farm planning, if we can help shift that and move it to be making sure that farm planning, because it's coming, is something that helps farmers be good farmers, rather than something that just helps me in Wellington collect lots of information that I can do stuff with. Then we've got an opportunity, and that's the test on us, is to make sure that it is about farmers becoming better farmers or understanding their resources better. But I agree completely. That capacity issue, and how we turn them from being worried and closed down and closed-minded, it's not sort of fear, but closed down to approach these sorts of issues, to being open and looking for those new opportunities, is going to be a real challenge for us.
So how do we make systems that adopt new technologies easily and routinely? And so you'll know I'm a huge fan of genetics as a delivery mechanism. Dosatron is a fantastic delivery mechanism. What are the ways in which we get the technologies that address at least the first tranche of these environmental concerns and just bed them in invisibly? Because if we don't do that, then really we're handing the game to the corporates that are big enough to have specialists to make all this stuff happen, and that's not where we want to go.
Yeah, I guess I just joined the coercive agreement there. And yeah, it's about getting the support structures into place to plug space, like space does, to cut away the cost of doing the measurements. So just have that information there for making decisions for all these other axes. Yeah.
That might lead into my next question, although I certainly didn't intend it to. At the very outset of this, Bruce talked about some work that was done back in the 1980s, and then near the end, Dan, you talked about almost growing up with these tools, and yet I think it would be reasonable to say that we've also seen the overall penetration of this technology being relatively low, in terms of tools that help people make better decisions on farm and optimise their feed management. And yet, one thing that I guess gave me huge, I guess a bit of promise for the future with space is, effectively, Grant, you talked about it being a 4-year sort of cycle from 2016 to here, and some of these latest changes, less than 2 years. And I think, Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong, but, I think you're seeing adoption that's into the thousands. So, what hope is there for shortening that cycle in the future to try and get some of the adoption, and it's not just adoption, right? It's taking basic research and getting it into technology in the first place. How can we get that happening a bit faster going forward? Who'd like to start? Shall I start at this end? Not everyone has to answer, by the way. We didn't give Andrew a chance to answer that last one.
I guess it's not just about adoption, but about usage as well. But yeah, I guess that a certain amount of acceptance that if you're having a fast cycle like this, the road is not without its rocks, as we encountered with each of the sort of tranches of work I talked about. Here's the sort of viable product, but here's what the customers have told us they now need. And then the next one is here's what the farmers have told us now that we've fixed those things. And so, yeah, just an awareness in, I guess, the providers and the customers that that's the sort of cycle we need if we're going to be developing at that pace.
I'll just add to that then the research organisations, so how do we get ourselves, as from a research organisation point of view, more in tune with the delivery and the co-development. So take the methane inhibitors, so we can't afford to sequentially develop an inhibitor and then a delivery system and then a farm system. We've got to do these things together, otherwise we're never going to get to 2030 in time. So I think that's a challenge to the investors to get build stronger linkages into the commercial and delivery sector, as well as the farmer, the customer understanding.
Yes, Bruce. And so I'm going to follow on that really. Money as an issue. We need good investment into our industry, and to, as I said, Google and Apple and these companies are throwing billions of dollars at these things. Improve is an example of a tool which, as industry organisations, we have to be careful that we don't sort of put a whole lot of millstones around our neck, because we're not. I'm going to speak for Dairy NZ, but we're not. Our levy intakes aren't going up, and so if we keep having. If we keep building tools which need, we turn into operational organisations. So we need investment, and then we need a way to make sure that they self-fund themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got a lot of interconnecting parts in this innovation infrastructure. How do we get them working together? We've got to take. We have to take each piece at a time. I think, in science, I think we can modernise our science workflows. We're probably 10 years behind where we should be, I think, in how we manage, handle, work, compute, methodology-wise, how we work with data. How do we smooth the relationships with partners? Do we have to take, MOUs up a level, or do we have to take individual contracting up a level to more flexible MOUs or something to get stuff done where it's of mutual benefit? How do we not let the contracting cycle kill our progress? We're all aiming for the same thing with the same largely common share of beneficiaries. I.e. farmer shareholders and the government shareholder I talked about. Why do we get in each other's way so often? And that's a good starting point, I think.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, it comes down to people working with people, and. Yeah, when it comes down to it, it's people working with people, and that's what works. People not working with people doesn't work. So if I look at the scope this down to the space development, I think we had a very good relationship between LIC and ourselves, where we saw it as a bit of a war. We were battling it on the technology front, on a number of other fronts, resourcing, but we're all in it to win. And look, you can get leg trip just on the contracting to start with, and I think both parties just thought we're going to make this work, and probably LIC bent a few rules, didn't quite do the full process that they normally do, and that was a real benefit. But there was a real. People have to want to try and win, I think.
Andrew, do you want to comment on that one as well?
Oh, look, just to say I agree with what Graeme was saying there in terms of collaboration. That's really been the cornerstone of our work on, with Dairy NZ in particular. Really enjoyed that. It opened up many more opportunities. And people working with people, really good relationships, working with the modelling group there. So, I concur. I think that's definitely where it is. We certainly do have these issues around funding. The whole science funding model in New Zealand doesn't really work that well in terms of generating a collaborative environment. But we do the best we can, and I guess when you get down to it, if you can find those gems where you're working well on a combined project and you see the co-benefits, then that's where you can really get some good benefits out of it. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Brilliant. Okay, some questions. Start over here.
Hello, Glenn Morgan here. I work for the government shareholder, MPI. Look, I really like what I'm seeing with these products, and I work in the adverse event recovery kind of field. And this summer just gone, we had the drought, and we formed the feed working group, which had a lot of agencies in here around that table, and particularly the Pasture Growth Forecaster, and where those things could be used to actually assist with assessing the impacts of adverse events, so floods, droughts, that sort of thing. Monetize it and actually look at the cost of impact of that, and also how we're going to manage the feed supplies that are in New Zealand during those times of feed shortages, so we can get good calculations of what's where and what isn't where, and how we can move stuff around. What are your thoughts, panel, on those sorts of areas and the application of these tools going forward?
Who'd like to start?
I think the data is there whereby we can start diagnosing stuff now. We have to join up some different data sets to do that, which is a painful exercise. But when we go into a drought or a dry period, I think drought should be reserved for larger continents, to be honest. But when we go into a dry period, what happens? Okay, the grass grows more slowly, and so if you're not thinking about it, you will feed a larger area, and you will eat that rapidly, and then you're going to run out of feed, and then you're in a hole. You're in a big hole. Okay, so what should actually be happening as it slows down and leaf emergence slows is that you should feed less, which means that you've got less supply, and you should be cutting back demand, and you should do that earlier rather than later. Okay, we have the ability to know at farm scale, but nationally, what the feed supply looks like on farm. Okay, and we have the ability to know who is doing stupid stuff. Okay, all the data's already there. It just needs a bunch of data sets joined up, and we can say who's doing stupid stuff, what does that mean for the feed supply, and what are the ultimate impacts of that. It's there.
I'm just going to leave that thought there. But I mean, certainly that during the past dry period and the work of the feed working group was really useful, and I know that the farmers who took advantage of that got good value out of it, and as an organisation, as an industry, we got good value out of knowing what was happening at a more macro level rather than the anecdote that you hear from whoever happens to be the noisiest drum. So it's really, really valuable from that point of view, and would be a useful resource to think about going forward into the future, to help people just be that half a step ahead of advance. Right, the old saying that a good farmer's a week earlier. The difference between a good farmer and a bad farmer's a week. It was already been used today, and that still holds true. The interesting thing too from that drought, and sheep and beef farm systems and dairy farm systems being quite different as to obviously how it plays out, but also our small blockers and our people who otherwise aren't really, don't have any of this a lot of this background skill, and how we think about them as well. 3 horses and 10 cows can get just as affected by a drought as 2,000 ewes, right?
Andrew, from a NIWA perspective, do you want to talk about some of the ways that perhaps some of that longer term forecasting could be integrated to help answer those questions?
Yeah, well, this is a real challenge, isn't it? Because as you go further out in time, also we have less ability to do those forecasts accurately. So we end up getting into the probabilistic space. A seasonal forecast will give you some understanding of what the chances of going into a dry period are, or staying in a dry period for an extended period. But there's also that might be like, there's a 50% chance. Well, that means it's a 50% chance you may not as well. So how do you manage your systems when you're now in this sort of space of probabilities and uncertainty, greater uncertainty? We're trying as best we can in Neal to improve our ability to give that longer range guidance. We are directly feeding that information and that guidance where we've got it into things like the National Adverse Events Committee that we've talked about, and also directly to NPI, and it goes out through various channels. But I still think we're in that, the real challenge is how do you utilise that information when you've now got the less, you've gone from observations, which are fantastic, because that's what's happened. You've got some short-term understanding of what you expect in the next week or 2 weeks, which has got some general reliability, but then now you're moving into this probability space. So I'd actually be quite interested to hear from the panel what they think. What is the usability there when you're moving from more certainty to more uncertainty? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by farmers who, as I've said in my presentation, they're really playing a game, a pastoral game, and making bets as they go along. And it always surprises me when farmers are saying, well, what is the average pasture production that I could get next month? Because I'm going to make a bet here about doing something that I might get an extra 50 grand, but it'll involve buying X number of bulls. And we're talking about the mean pasture growth for next month, so you've got a 50% chance of failing. And most people, when they're playing a game of cards, they don't bet very high on a 50% chance of failing. So I think we can do a lot more with statistics to line up, and it's very difficult to get farmers to think when you start saying to them, let's work on probabilities. It's a mindset change. But what probability of growth do you need for the strategy which you are going to embark? And I think that's the relevant question. But how do you present that easily for the farmer to be able to get an answer? And without good pasture growth forecasts from good model data, from good calibration data, it is quite difficult.
So to pick up that, and when Andrew talked about, as you go out in the future, you've got more uncertainty, and from my observation is what good farmers do in that situation is they build a range of scenarios, and so you replace, you have uncertainty in the forecast, but you have certainty in your options, and if it keeps on tracking this way, well, here are the options that play out, and as Dan said, the ones who are better at anticipating make earlier calls and earlier bets, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. My observation is that you're very seldom wrong acting early.
I think it's the key bit, Bruce.
Cool. Jeremy, I saw your hand.
So I think the key to this is with all these farm environment plans and all the technology, making it as collaborative and interoperable, sharing the data. So I guess there's two questions. One so you've got the pasture measurements now from LIC. Are you looking to then share that with the likes of a Farm IQ or a FarmX to then make those decisions? Because I think that's the ultimate way that farmers are going to get the most value out of paying for that service in there, rather than necessarily, say, LIC trying to develop a competing product, sharing that. So first question, and then I guess we've been in situations, so I'm at Ag Research now, where in terms of using sensor devices, there's a partner that hasn't come in with the mindset of allowing you access to the data for research. And actually, we made the call to call it early. I would have known it earlier, but to say, well, no, they don't have the right mindset for what we want to achieve as the industry, and go to that next partner who may not be as mature, but they're coming in with that collaborative access mindset. So do you see that in terms of Dairy NZ or Beef and Lamb, your role to almost say, well, you have to come in with the right mindset for research, otherwise we're almost perpetuating something that we don't want. So first, I guess, LIC, what partnerships?
I think for this one, I'm going to have to hand it over to my distinguished colleagues from the commercial arm of the business. This is an outside R&D question.
Yeah, so farm management software. Yeah, so from a space point of view, farm management software platforms are already, there's quite a lot of options, as you pointed out, in New Zealand already. We're not planning to develop a competing one. Space is about collecting the pasture data, the actual measurements itself. We're looking at collaborations with already existing platforms in the industry.
Are they commenced already, or is it
Some are work in progress, as in exploration. I wouldn't say there's anything in the very short term, but yeah.
Brilliant. Who wants to tackle Jeremy's other question?
I was just going to go with that first one, but well, it might be partly in the second one. So I think we need a paradigm shift in this area, and I think it's happening, where businesses understand what it is that they do that adds the value. So for us in the Pasture Growth Forecaster, it's getting better, more accurate, longer-term forecasts, and that's what we want to concentrate on. We don't want to build a B2C. We want to give those forecasts to people who will use them to add value. So I think for businesses need to stay focused on what they're doing. And look, if we went to a B2C, my general rule of thumb after managing Farm Max and whatever it costs to build the technology, multiply that by 3 to get your engagement with the end market. If it costs you $1 million, you've got $2 more million to spend on all of those workshops and whatever it takes to engage, and it's a lot. So going forward, it's a far easier thing for a business to say, we want that data from you, what's the cost and how do we access it? Rather than saying, goodness, we need that data, we're going to have to build something to do it. It just adds to your timelines, puts more risk in your business, particularly investing in areas where it's something that is not actually part of your business model.
Does anyone want to cover the other question about more around collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess from our point, certainly from my point of view, that's a very hard yes answer to that. That our role is about and really encouraging that collaboration and that single use of using data in lots of ways. I think it's probably, to be honest, I think it's a bit of turning into an old-fashioned view. The old data is the new oil, and you have to own the data. And I think that it feels like the companies that have been successful are actually moving past that, and it's more about providing solutions for people to use. The reason why most of us are in this room is because we want farmers to be successful, and if that means we've got to get these tools in their hands. I also wanted to answer Andrew's question real quickly because I did have an answer for that. The further we get into looking out into the future, the less useful it is in terms of decision making, because on most sheep and beef farm systems there's so many levers that until it gets a bit closer, knowing that it's going to be dry sometime this summer is not a whole lot of help, but knowing what my pasture is going to be doing in 3 or 4 weeks is quite a bit more useful, if that makes sense, because then we're also playing markets and all sorts of things are playing into those decisions rather than just feed production itself.
On the data side, so with the GPS sensors on cows. We looked at two options. One, the digit animal from Spain, and another one was a generic one that we had to sort of mock up ourselves. I think Pete actually probably did a lot of the legwork, but it was quite difficult to get the data out of the Spaniards. They were the data as the new oil people. So for our uses, it was easier to take an off-the-shelf thing and ruggedise it to try and make it cow-proof and accept possibly a slightly higher fail rate, and then have access to the data we needed, than to go with a pre-existing tested bit of kit. Having said that, in both of those cases, I see them being superseded by a newer technology. At the further end, virtual fencing does everything that the location devices do plus more. But at the near end, there's 3 different providers, probably by February next year, of a solar-powered GPS location ear tag. So, I mean, we've got a running start in terms of we've worked with some of the data, we understand some of the limitations, we understand how we use that with other data to get something useful. But yeah, the ones that we would work with in the future will be determined by their willingness to collaborate and do what's required.
And of course, willingness to share data doesn't mean it has to be for free, right? Because there's still the cost of acquisition. Okay, other questions? Yep.
Looking forward a bit, and Dan, I think you opened the door on this one. Space plus virtual fencing, where does that take us?
The final frontier.
Yeah, all the way to space. That is really, really interesting, right? Because then we can start look at all sorts of interesting farm models, farm business models. Some days I have in my head that that challenge we have with finishing deer and all this beautiful flat land around the Waikato that doesn't get used for deer finishing because it hasn't got deer fences on it. So the sky's really the limit, right? In terms of how that really opens up the ability for us to make our money out of harvesting our pastures, but doing it in a way that looks after our the other really important capital. So we've got our land, how we look after our animals, and also how we look after our people, which is sort of that unspoken labour issue which lies underneath quite a lot of what we think about and do too. So yeah, but I guess your point is about how these things have to work together, because a virtual collar by itself, which isn't talking to a pasture predictive model, which isn't talking to my ear tags for NAIT compliance, just turns into a hassle for me, and I go back to riding my horse.
Having had to rehome deer a couple of times on my deer farm in the past, I broke into a cold sweat at the idea of opening the gate and letting them wander. But in warrant to your question, I think there's a technology wave coming now which makes a whole lot of things that people have only dreamed about in the past possible. And you get rid of farmers Graham's age, for example, and you're bringing new generations through with new business models. There's a whole bunch of exciting stuff that's going to happen. Particularly, to the point Mark was just making, that if we kind of lead the way, not with actual products, but with concepts, and explore explore the space, explore the territory, then that helps that whole co-development with the actual technology coming along. So, yeah, all sorts of things are going to be possible in the next decade.
What's fascinating to see is like the two different modes of operation of your major virtual fencing players. You've got halter, agile, young, getting out there and doing the stuff, and then you've got perhaps older, possibly wiser crew in Adjacents, and who are potentially biting off things less slowly, doing things perhaps more methodically. one of the things that you get from discussions is a very different way of doing things. One's intent on conquering the world, and you can probably guess which one that is. One of the things that I'm super keen to see is that both of those businesses remain competitive in the space. Because if you think about pricing models, so A2 milk, okay, that company is worth megabucks. At one point, I'm not sure today, worth more than Fonterra, but processing a very small percentage of the milk. That's because the value chain, they collected most of that value from the value chain. They realised they only had to pay farmers a very small amount to switch to A2, and then they collect the profit on the or the value that's created for the consumer, or most of it. We ideally do not see that happen with virtual fencing. If there's one clear winner in that space, okay, if all the labour saving benefit, if all of the pasture management benefit is extracted through the price that's charged for that technology, then are we really any better off? I'm super keen to see the technology space remain competitive, so that the farmers actually see some of the benefit of the technology.
Or owned by the cooperatives, of course.
Brilliant. Time? Okay, well that sounds like a great thing to do, Warren.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Warren King, President of the New Zealand Grasslands Association, and on behalf of NZGA, I'd just like to congratulate LIC, Dairy NZ and Reserve as well for a product that we've seen mature over the last few years, the technology and the science behind it. And it's now got to a point where really exciting things are possible, and we of course we want more. We want it better, stronger and faster in the future as well. But for now, bloody well done. I just want to take this opportunity, while I've got the microphone as well, just to alert you to the to part 2 of the NZGA virtual conference, which is this coming Wednesday from 4:30. It's only for 90 minutes, and I think the themes in that session will be very familiar to the attendees for today's meeting. Even more than that, I'd just like to alert you to the Resilient Pastures Symposium, and there are many people in this room who are actually involved in that, who will be presenting or on the organising committee. Next May in the Waikato, and I think it covers, again, very similar themes to many of those that have been picked up today. So we look forward to seeing you there, and thank you, Andrew.
Brilliant. So, look, it remains to me to thank the panel, and I'll ask you all to just give them a hand for that. And for those of you who are in the room, I think there's lunch provided just out there. Brilliant. Follow Miranda, she'll show you where to go. And apologies, we don't yet have a virtual lunch for those who are online. I want to say thanks very much to Andrew Tait as well for his patience, and thank you for all coming.